My talk is called For Whom Bell Tolls. I know, it's a little cheesy, but you got to do something these days. Can local democracy be diverse? And I'm going to start with kind of the ideal of local democracy, the things that we believe about local democracy. From what the National Civic League once wrote, it is in cities, counties, towns, and villages that the people have to learn the practice of democratic, responsible self-government. Well, we actually just heard from a mayor and city council member about the daily work of democracy. We value this tremendously. We just never remembered to actually put it in the Constitution. So local government does not exist in the Constitution of the United States, which is one of the problems local governments run into. But nonetheless, it exists very much in our imagination. And in fact, Americans trust their local government much more than they trust other levels of government. As you can see here in a couple of polls, more than half in a CNN poll trust their local government to do the right thing, but only 26% trust the federal government to do the right thing. In Gallup poll in 2008, 42% trust the president. It was not a particularly good year for that president anyway. 47% trust Congress, but 67% trust the state and 72% trust the local. The lower you get on the food chain of American government, the more people feel connected to their government, but not so connected that they would actually vote in local elections, because indeed our voting patterns are the exact reverse of that. Our highest turnout by far is in federal elections, then state elections, and then local elections. But as it turns out, that's not as bizarre as it may seem. And that's part of what I want to talk about today, which is how our system kind of structures who participates and what impact that has on the representation of diverse groups. Norman Rockwell, I wonder if we should turn a light down or something, because these are so light. No, nope, sorry, excuse me, TV rules. Did a famous series of paintings called The Four Freedoms, and my favorite is freedom of speech. And this picture, I think, is one of the most meaningful pictures about American local democracy I've ever seen. It's really quite marvelous. We see a young man, a working man, dressed in working man's clothes, speaking at a public meeting with a document in his pocket, and all the other people, even the better dressed people, leaning toward him attentively, listening to what he has to say. In the hand of the person in the lower part of the picture is a document that lists the name of his local town where this event is taking place. This is the public meeting, the speaking at the public meeting, which is one of the great things about American local democracy. You cannot go speak to Congress. You cannot go speak to the state legislature, but you can go speak to your city council, and if necessary, in some cases, as you know, council member and mayor, harangue them, scream at them, occasionally say a nice word or two, but it's something that we treasure. I think it's very important to realize that the person making this talk right now in the 1940s is a white working man. It's important to see the symbolism of that, because our ideal of local democracy is a little bit out of date, because many of our local communities are much more diverse than that. And would it be wonderful if our local democracy was in as good shape as this picture shows, where a working person of any group could stand before the council and be heard in a really good way? Because what we've lately discovered is that Norman Rockwell meets Robert Rizzo, what we might call the cautionary tale of all local government today. Now, I am a huge fan of local government and have been my whole life, and I'm not one of those people who says all local government is Bell. Most local governments are quite honestly run, quite efficiently run, but trust me, every local government in California is now living in the shadow of what Robert Rizzo did, and they think about it every single day in terms of how it will affect their ability to get their work done. But what's most significant for the talk I want to give is where Robert Rizzo carried out his crime. It was the city of Bell, California. And if ever there was a place where local democracy needs to work for a diverse community, it's a city like Bell, California. It's not a city, an affluent city with a well-educated population whose democracy will take care of itself. It's a city with a population of only 36,000 people, 90% of whom are Latino, more than half are foreign-born. Only 4% of the population has a bachelor's degree. 36% of adults have a high school diploma. It's only 2.5 square miles. It's a tiny city. It became a charter city in 2005, which I'll return to. It has a city budget of approximately $15 million. And as you can see on the map, up in the upper left-hand corner is the city of Los Angeles. And these are called the southeastern cities of LA County. Maywood, Bell Gardens, Downey, Huntington Park, Bellflower. A number of these cities had serious governing problems in the last few years, some of which led to indictment of public officials. So when you think about the need for democracy and the democratic institutions that were there for people who really need good local government, which is working class and minority voters, and people who were not voters, there was a catastrophic failure in the city of Bell. And thank God for two reporters, Jeff Gottlieb and Ruben Vivas of the Los Angeles Times, who managed to break the story of what happened in Bell. They discovered that the city manager, Robert Rizzo, was earning over $787,000, which turned out, by the way, to be only half of his annual income from the city. Through other perks, he was actually gaining $1.5 million a year. Do you remember the budget of the city of Bell? So 1/10 of the city budget went into the pocket of this guy. The police chief was earning quite a bit more than the President of the United States, who has somewhat larger responsibilities. The assistant city manager, $376,000. You should understand that the average city manager in California makes about $210,000 a year for a very hard job and an insecure job, and they're well worth every penny. These people are not remotely worth it. These three people pulled down well over 10% of the city budget even before we knew how much extra stuff they were getting. Many new details emerged, and then we discovered that the city council members were making roughly $100,000 a year for part-time work attending meetings once a month. As they used to say, nice work if you can get it. That would be a great job. The average city council member, again, as you can tell us, makes, as they used to say in Yiddish, bupkis. Almost nothing to be a city council member and to be on call all the time to the voters. These people were not on call. They were hardly working at all. I won't go through everything that this scheme involved, but it was basically a scheme to raise revenue from a working class Latino community with a lot of undocumented residents, which is about as vicious an extortion scheme as you can find. I'll only point out a couple of things. One is that they cut city services to the bone in order to generate more money to put in their own pockets. These are predators. They shook down local businesses for illegal fees and charges, and they concentrated on what they called mom and pop stores, who would be the most vulnerable. One that the U.S. Justice Department is looking at is they towed the cars of undocumented residents who they targeted as undocumented residents and then charged them 3 times the normal towing charge in Los Angeles County to get their car back, knowing that under no circumstances would they complain. And the reason they towed their car is not that there was anything wrong with their car, but that they did not have a driver's license. Kind of a vicious circle. So they actually, the police kept little rating cards that later were revealed in which they had a game in which they calculated to compete against each other how many cars of undocumented residents they could tow in a given month. This is only about 1/3 of what they did, and I won't go through everything except as a charter guy, which is my own background, they actually became a charter city so that they could steal more money. They wanted to get around state law, which limited how much they could pay their council members. That's the reason they adopted a charter in 2005. However, just to point out what I'm getting at, they scheduled the charter election for November 29th in an odd-numbered year, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Did not have it run by the county, but only by the city. Only 390 people voted, 239 of them by absentee, many of which were questionable ballots. What am I saying here? Not to get into all the financial details, but these were people who took advantage of the flaw in local democracy that particularly disadvantages working class and minority residents. And that is what my next slide is. How has urban reform really worked? I come from the East Coast. where there's machine politics, which I don't like and I prefer it out here. That's the politics of political party organizations, of patronage, of bosses, of precinct managers bringing people to the polls. Well, we got rid of that in California through something called reform. We introduced nonpartisan elections, elections in odd-numbered years. We don't pay our elected officials in local government in most cases. They have to be making a living another way. All the things that would make city government cleaner. And I agree with those things, and I prefer those things, and that's the kind of government I want to live under, but we must face the fact that reform has a racial and class bias. Political party organizations generate far more turnout among working class and minority voters than the reform systems do. And I can just make it very simple for you. If you hold an election in an odd-numbered year with no listing of party designations, the voting turnout will be very low among the very people that you would want to reach in local democracy. I'll show you some numbers. I call this a silent voting crisis. It's silent because we rarely even notice it, because how do you notice the dog that doesn't bark? The person that doesn't vote. Well, you notice it in Bell when that person becomes the victim of organized predators because of that. In Los Angeles, 2 city council districts, the 1st and the 5th. The 1st is on the east side of Los Angeles. It's near City Hall, near Dodger Stadium. It's a working class Latino community. The 5th district is where UCLA is, the west side where the Grove is, a very affluent west side community with a high level of education. Same number of people because of the one person, one vote in each district, but only 60,000 voters in the 1st district, 167,000 registered voters in the 5th district. So when you consider voice in a reform system without parties, you will discover that the voting is skewed away from minority and working class voters. But look what happens in a presidential election. In that 1st council district, where only 11,000 people voted in the city election, 42,000 came out when Barack Obama was on the ballot in November of 2008. It's almost like 2 different countries. The odd-numbered country and the even-numbered country. The odd-numbered system of power and the even-numbered system of power. And in 2001, even in an odd-numbered year, in a local nonpartisan election, when the voters of Bell were angry enough, they turned out to vote. 1/3 of the registered voters in Bell turned out this month to turn their city council members out and elect an entirely new city council. But you cannot rely in a system that discourages, through its structures, the participation of such voters, the fact that once in a while they will throw the bums out, because then we may return to a low mobilization period. What can we do about this? And a couple of days ago, Tim Rutan in the LA Times suggested we should go back to partisan elections in Los Angeles, bring back political parties. I actually wrote him an email today, said good luck. You will never get that done in California, plus you'd have to amend the Constitution, because the Constitution makes elections nonpartisan. But I've heard a couple of other really neat ideas. One is to link local elections to be held the same time as state and federal elections. Santa Monica does that now when they've seen their voting turnout go up. Anything that involves state and federal elections with political parties will bring working class and minority people to the polls, there's no question. But another way to do it that's been proposed by the head of Common Cause, I think is even more realistic. Put all local elections on the same day, even in an odd-numbered year, and make it California Local Government Day. Make a big deal about it, get everybody excited about it, and say whether you're rich or poor or white or Latino or Asian or African American, young or old, today's your day for your local government. I think that's a wonderful idea. I'd like to see that idea get more currency. I think we should elect the executives instead of having 5-member boards of supervisors. One thing people don't realize, that county government is poor people's government. City government tends to be middle-class government, but nobody knows who runs it. I believe we should have county mayors. I believe we should reduce the 2/3 requirement for taxes statewide and for various local measures, because it's easy to discourage people who are only occasional participants. And if they elect people who can't carry out what they said. It's a big problem. All these are ideas that would be fun. I participated in the creation of another idea, and it turned out to have mixed results. In 1999, I was the head staff person for the charter reform in Los Angeles, and we created a system of neighborhood councils, and it was going to solve all these problems. It was all going to look like the Norman Rockwell picture. Everyone was going to come to the podium, and everyone was going to be heard. And in truth, it did a lot. There were hundreds, in some cases thousands of people in LA who had never participated, who did come to the podium and did come to speak and be heard at City Hall. Then they put me in charge of the Neighborhood Council Review Commission to look at that system after 7 years. And we found good news and bad news. We found so many people who had never been involved in local government now involved. But you know what we also found? Some of the same racial and class differences were actually reinforced by this system, because it was difficult to participate. It wasn't easy. It wasn't as easy as voting. And the more difficult you make the bar of participation, the more you discourage people who are not middle class and educated. And what we found is that the neighborhood council system tended to be dominated by white middle class voters in affluent neighborhoods who were interested in development issues and basically the homeowner's agenda. And that's a big problem for the system, a big problem for the system. What we really need to do is to make access more diverse and more accessible, simpler. And this goes against everything we've really come to believe. We've come to believe that you can only have ethics or participation and not both. Because I believe we can have clean local government, as we largely do, but it can also be high participation local government. It doesn't have to be only government that's clean, where the voters are already attentive and able to handle it. Can working class or minority residents get good government? I'll tell you, if you walk into Bell today, those people will tell you they expect good government from now on. And you're going to be in big trouble if you try to steal $1 in Bell from the public treasury, which is the same thing in Southgate after what they went through a few years ago. I think that's a great development. But I want to suggest that we go back to Norman Rockwell's picture and ask this question: who is the figure in that painting if we were drawing it today? If we were drawing that picture today, who would be that person who we want to have able to stand up there in front of the city council and weigh in and be heard? I can tell you most likely that person will be Latino or Latina, be young, be someone who hasn't been heard from before, who has aspirations to change the system, and has every right and reason to expect that local democracy to be as good for their aspirations as Norman Rockwell thought it was for the aspirations of the person he painted more than 50 years before. And I believe if we set ourselves that goal, that local democracy will be just fine in California, as long as we don't settle for a limited, constricted democracy that doesn't give everybody a chance.